Hello, welcome to Return to Life. Today, we will listen to a story about the cracks in life where people have felt weak, full of doubt, yet kept moving forward. If you are standing between exhaustion and hope, this story may be for you.
The doctor didn't touch her neck. Not at first. He stood under the hard white light of the emergency room, one hand resting near the edge of the bed rail, his eyes fixed on the left side of Savannah Cole's neck, as if he were looking at something that didn't belong there. The room itself was quiet in the strange, unnatural way hospitals often were at night. There were sounds, of course, the low hum of fluorescent lights, the rolling squeak of a cart somewhere down the hall, a monitor beeping in another room, rubber soles against polished floors. But inside the small exam room where Savannah sat with her back straight and her fingers pressed lightly against the base of her throat, everything felt suspended. She had stopped trying to guess what the staff were thinking the moment the nurse walked in, took one look at her, and quietly stepped back out to get the doctor without asking the usual questions first. No one had asked if it itched. No one had asked if something stung her. No one had even asked what bit her. Instead, the doctor leaned slightly closer, not enough to frighten her, but enough to make it clear that whatever he was seeing, he was taking it seriously. "How long has it been there?" he asked. Savannah swallowed before answering. Even that had started to feel different. Not painful, just tight, careful. As if her own body had begun negotiating with a space that wasn't meant to be there. "A few days," she said. Her voice sounded smaller than she expected. "Maybe longer." The doctor glanced at her chart, then back at her neck. "Has it been getting bigger?" That question landed harder than it should have. Savannah looked past him toward the curtain, toward the thin strip of hallway light visible near the floor. Somewhere outside the room, someone laughed softly, quickly, the kind of tired laugh hospital workers used to survive a long shift. But inside, the air had changed. Bigger. Not the kind of question you asked about a bite. Not the kind of question you asked if you thought someone just needed ointment and a few days of rest. She became aware, all at once, of how still everybody was. The nurse stood near the counter with a blood pressure cuff in one hand and a pen in the other. She wasn't writing. She was waiting. The doctor still hadn't touched the swelling. He was studying the shape of it, the subtle rise under the skin, the way the surface looked almost too calm for the tension beneath it. There was no dramatic redness, no angry irritation, no obvious wound that matched the unease in the room. That was part of what made it so unsettling. It didn't look violent, it looked quiet. And somehow, that was worse. Savannah shifted slightly on the bed. The paper beneath her crackled. Her boots were still dusty. She noticed that for no good reason. Dust along the edges, dry mud near one heel. She'd come in so fast she hadn't even thought to change. 1 minute she had been standing in her kitchen with one hand on the counter, trying to steady herself after another wave of dizziness. The next, Ethan Walker had her in his truck, one hand on the wheel, the other reaching across every few seconds, as if touching her shoulder could keep something worse from happening. Now Ethan sat in the chair against the wall, elbows on his knees, hat in his hands. He hadn't spoken since they got there. That alone scared her more than anything. Ethan was never a man who wasted words, but he always said something. A joke, an observation. A calm, simple sentence to make a rough moment easier to stand inside. But not tonight. Tonight his jaw was tight, and his eyes kept moving between Savannah and the doctor, as though he were trying to understand how a thing they had both dismissed could now look like this. The doctor finally put on gloves. It should have been reassuring. Instead, it felt ceremonial. "When did you first notice it?" he asked. Savannah let out a breath and tried to think clearly. "I thought it was a bug bite," she said. "At first, it was just a small spot. Didn't hurt, didn't itch, didn't seem like much." The doctor's expression didn't change, but he exchanged a quick glance with the nurse, and that tiny movement was enough. Enough to tell her that whatever story she had been telling herself for the last several days had already ended. Whatever this was, it had crossed into a different category before she ever walked through the hospital doors. He touched the side of her neck then, gently, carefully, 2 fingers pressing near the swelling but not directly on top of it. Savannah's shoulders tensed. Not because it hurt. It still didn't, not exactly. That was the part that made no sense. The pressure had grown. The heaviness had grown. The strange, rooted feeling under the skin had grown. But pain had never arrived the way she thought it would. No sharp warning, no dramatic signal, just a slow takeover of space. The doctor moved his hand away. "Any trouble breathing?" A little, she admitted. Mostly tonight. Swallowing? She nodded. He looked at the nurse. Let's move quickly on imaging. Quickly. That word stayed with her. Not soon. Not eventually. Not, let's take a look when we can. Quickly. Ethan lifted his head. Doctor, he said, his voice low and even. What are we looking at? The doctor didn't answer right away, and in that pause Savannah felt something cold move through her chest. Not panic. Not yet. Something more precise. The sensation of realizing, before anyone says it aloud, that the people in the room know more than you do, and none of it is good. We need to see how far this goes, the doctor said at last. How far this goes. Not what it is. Not whether it's serious. How far? Savannah looked down at her own hands. Her fingernails were clean except for a faint line of ranch dust she had missed. She rubbed her thumb against the side of her index finger without noticing she was doing it. She thought of the bathroom mirror at home, the soft yellow light over the sink, her hand lifting her hair away from her neck. The moment she had told herself, again, that it was nothing, because nothing that quiet could be dangerous. She had believed that. Maybe that was the worst part. Not that she had missed some obvious sign, not that she had ignored terrible pain or dramatic swelling or blood or fever. It had been none of those things. It had been subtle, still, easy to explain away, easy to fit into the ordinary rhythm of a life lived outdoors, where bites, scratches, bruises, and soreness were all just part of being alive. But by the time she sat under the fluorescent lights with a doctor measuring his words and Ethan holding his breath from across the room, no one was treating it like something ordinary anymore. And for the first time since she had noticed that tiny mark on her neck, Savannah understood something she could no longer talk herself out of. Whatever had started there was not fading. It was growing. Savannah Cole had never been the kind of person who worried about small things. Out where she lived, worrying didn't fix fences, didn't feed animals, didn't keep the dust from settling into every crack of wood and metal that made up a life built far from anything polished or easy. You dealt with what needed dealing with, and you moved on. That was the rhythm. That was the agreement between her and the land. She had grown up on that same stretch of Texas ground, where the horizon ran wide and uninterrupted, and the wind carried more dust than answers. By the time she was old enough to make her own decisions, she had already learned most of what mattered. How to read the sky before a storm. How to tell when an animal was off before it showed obvious signs. How to work through pain without announcing it to the world. Pain, at least, made sense. Pain told you where to look. Pain gave you a reason to stop. What she had felt over the past few days didn't. That was part of why she ignored it. Most mornings, Savannah was up before the sun had fully cleared the horizon. The light would come in slowly, stretching across the fields in long, quiet lines, catching the dust in the air, before settling over the fencing, the barn, the low structures that made up the ranch. She would pull on her boots, grab her hat, and step outside without much thought. The air always smelled the same at that hour. Dry earth, hay, a faint trace of something metallic carried in the wind. It was a life that didn't ask for permission, and Savannah had always liked that. She moved through her days with a kind of steady efficiency, checking water levels, walking the perimeter, fixing what needed fixing before it became a bigger problem. There was a confidence in the way she worked, not loud or showy, just built over years of repetition. Her hands were rough in the way hands became when they were used more than they were protected. Her skin carried the mark of the sun. Her posture carried the quiet certainty of someone who knew exactly where she stood in the world. The first time Ethan Walker noticed her, years ago, it had been because of that. Not because she was trying to stand out, but because she didn't need to. Ethan's place sat just beyond the western fence line, close enough that they crossed paths more often than either of them could avoid. At first, it had been nothing more than a nod, a quick exchange of information. A borrowed tool returned a day later than promised, the kind of interactions that built familiarity without requiring anything more. But over time, something shifted. It happened slowly, the way most real things do. A longer conversation here, a shared drink there, a moment of standing side by side, looking out over land that neither of them owned entirely, but both understood in a way outsiders never would. Ethan was a quiet man, but not an empty one. He paid attention. That was the difference. Where other people filled silence with words, Ethan seemed comfortable letting things sit. He spoke when it mattered, and when he did, it usually landed. Savannah respected that. More than that, she trusted it. Their time together wasn't something either of them labeled. It didn't need to be. It lived in small, consistent moments. Late afternoons leaning against the fence line, talking about repairs that needed doing. Evenings where one of them would bring over a couple of beers, and they'd sit outside watching the sun disappear, without feeling the need to comment on it. There was something about those moments that made everything else feel distant. Simpler. Safer. On one of those evenings, just a few days before she ended up in the hospital, Savannah had been sitting on the tailgate of her truck, one boot resting on the bumper, the other on the ground. Ethan stood nearby, one hand hooked into his belt, the other holding a bottle that had long since gone warm. "You've been at it all day?" he asked, glancing toward the barn. "Most of it," she said. "Fence line on the north side needed fixing again." He nodded once, like that confirmed something he already expected. The light at that hour softened everything. The hard edges of the day blurred just enough to make the world feel less demanding. Savannah tilted her head slightly, rolling her shoulder as if working out a stiffness she hadn't noticed earlier. Ethan's eyes followed the movement. "You all right?" he asked. "Yeah," she said without hesitation. It was automatic. She lifted her hand briefly, brushing her fingers along the side of her neck without really thinking about it. The spot was still there. Small, easy to ignore. The kind of thing that didn't deserve attention. Ethan noticed anyway. "What's that?" he asked, stepping a little closer. Savannah shrugged. "Something probably got me out in the grass." He leaned in just enough to see it better, but not enough to invade her space. That was another thing about him. He always seemed to know where the line was. "Doesn't look like much," he said. "It isn't," she replied. And she believed that. Because it didn't hurt. Because it didn't itch. Because it didn't demand anything from her. Out there, those were the rules. If something was serious, your body told you. Loudly, clearly. There was no reason to question that. Not when every other experience she'd ever had confirmed it. Ethan studied it for another second, then straightened. "You sure?" he asked. Savannah gave a small, easy smile. "If it was something, I'd feel it." He held her gaze for a moment longer than usual, as if weighing whether to push further. Then he nodded, accepting her answer, or at least choosing not to argue with it. "All right," he said. The conversation moved on. They talked about weather, about a neighbor who had been having trouble with his equipment, about nothing that mattered in the long run, the kind of conversation that filled space without creating weight. But every now and then, without realizing it, Savannah's hand drifted back to her neck. Just a light touch. Just enough to remind herself it was still there. Still small. Still quiet. Still nothing. And that was exactly why she let it go. Because in her world, the dangerous things didn't stay quiet. Life out on the ranch had a rhythm you didn't question. It didn't change much from day to day, and that was exactly why people stayed. Not because it was easy, but because it was predictable in the ways that mattered. The sun came up when it was supposed to. The work waited where you left it. The land didn't pretend to be anything other than what it was. Savannah had always found comfort in that. There were no surprises in the way the wind moved across the fields, or in the way the dust settled over everything by the end of the afternoon. Even the animals followed patterns if you paid enough attention. A restless shift before weather changed. A quiet stillness before night settled in. Everything had its place. Everything made sense if you stayed long enough to learn it. That was the kind of world she trusted. Which was why the things that didn't fit into that rhythm felt so easy to dismiss. Because most of the time, they disappeared on their own. The days that followed that evening with Ethan moved the way they always did. Savannah woke early, stepped out into the dry morning air, and got to work before her body had fully caught up. There was a fence post leaning on the south end that needed reinforcing. One of the water troughs had a slow leak she'd been meaning to fix. A section of ground near the barn had started to sink slightly after the last rain. Nothing urgent. Nothing unusual. She worked through it all with the same steady pace, moving from one task to the next, letting the hours pass without marking them. The sun climbed, burned, then softened again as it made its way across the sky. Sweat dried. Dust settled. The day folded into evening the way it always did. And through all of it, that small spot on her neck remained exactly what she expected it to be. Quiet. Unimportant. If anything, she thought less about it as the days went on. That was the strange part. You would think something unfamiliar would demand more attention, that it would pull at your awareness until you dealt with it. But this didn't. It blended in. It became part of the background, like the ache in her shoulders or the stiffness in her hands at the end of a long day. Something you noticed, but didn't question. One afternoon, a few days later, Ethan showed up again, just as the light began to soften. He didn't call ahead. He never did. Out here, you didn't need to. If someone drove up, it meant they had a reason, or they didn't, and both were acceptable. Savannah was standing near the barn, wiping her hands on a rag that had already seen better days when she heard the low rumble of his truck. She didn't turn right away. There was something about the sound of it that had become familiar enough to recognize without looking. The way it idled, the slight delay before the engine cut off, the quiet after. "You planning on working through the whole evening again?" Ethan called out as he stepped down from the driver's side. Savannah glanced over her shoulder, a faint smile pulling at the corner of her mouth. "Someone's got to keep things from falling apart." He walked toward her, boots kicking up small clouds of dust with each step. "Things look fine to me. That's because I keep them that way." He let out a short breath that might have been a laugh. "Yeah, I figured." They stood there for a moment, not quite facing each other fully, not quite looking away. The kind of pause that didn't need filling. Ethan held up a paper bag. "Brought food," he said. "Figured you forgot to eat again." "I didn't forget," she replied. "You didn't have time," he corrected. She didn't argue. They moved over to the side of the barn where the shade lingered a little longer, sitting on an old wooden beam that had been repurposed into something like a bench. The food was simple, nothing fancy, but out there, it didn't need to be. They ate in the same quiet rhythm they shared everything else in. At some point, Savannah reached up again, absent-mindedly brushing her fingers along her neck. Ethan noticed. He always noticed. "You're still messing with that," he said. Savannah paused, her hand lingering for just a second longer before she dropped it. "Didn't even realize I was doing it." He shifted slightly closer, leaning just enough to get a better look. The light caught the side of her neck differently now, softer, angled. The spot was still subtle. Still easy to miss if you weren't looking for it. But Ethan was. "It looks," he started, then stopped. Savannah glanced at him. "Looks, what?" He hesitated, searching for the right word. "Different." She gave a small shake of her head. "It's the light." "Maybe." But he didn't sound convinced. Savannah wiped her hands again, more out of habit than need. "It doesn't hurt," she said. "Hasn't from the start." Ethan leaned back slightly, resting his forearms on his knees. "That's the part I don't like." She let out a quiet breath, something between a sigh and a laugh. "You don't like a lot of things." "Yeah," he said, "but I usually have a reason." There was a brief silence. Not uncomfortable, but not as easy as before. Savannah shifted her weight, rolling her neck slightly as if to prove a point. "See? Nothing." The movement was smooth, controlled. But for just a fraction of a second, something in her expression tightened. It passed quickly. So quickly that if Ethan hadn't been watching her closely, he might have missed it. "What?" he asked. "Nothing," she said. He didn't respond right away. The wind picked up slightly, moving through the dry grass in long, soft waves. Somewhere in the distance, a gate creaked as it shifted against its hinges. Savannah stood, brushing off her jeans. "I've got a few more things to finish before it gets dark." Ethan nodded slowly, still looking at her. "You always do." She met his eyes for a moment, then looked away. "If it gets worse, I'll have it checked," she said. It sounded reasonable. It sounded responsible. It sounded like something anyone would say. Ethan studied her for another second, then gave a small nod. "All right." But neither of them said what they were both thinking. Because out there, things didn't usually get worse without warning. They didn't stay quiet while they grew. And if they did, no one really talked about that. The next time Savannah really looked at it, she wasn't planning to. It happened in the bathroom, late in the evening, after a long day that had left her more tired than usual. Not the kind of tired she was used to. This was different, not sharp, not overwhelming, just heavier, like her body was asking for more rest than she normally gave it. She leaned over the sink, turning on the faucet, letting the water run for a second before splashing it lightly across her face. The mirror above the sink was slightly fogged around the edges, the light casting a soft yellow tone that blurred small imperfections. For a moment, she didn't look up. Then she did, and her eyes went straight to her neck. The spot was still there. That wasn't surprising. What was how clearly she could see it now. Savannah reached up, slowly, pushing her hair aside. Her fingers found the familiar place without hesitation, pressing lightly against the skin. She paused. Something about it felt different. Not painful, not sensitive, Just wrong. She pressed again, this time a little firmer. The skin didn't react the way she expected. It didn't shift under her touch the way a swollen bite usually would. It didn't soften or flatten. It held its shape. Savannah tilted her head slightly, studying it more closely. It wasn't just a mark anymore. It had form, a subtle rise beneath the skin, not obvious enough to alarm someone at a glance, but once you noticed it, it was impossible to unsee. She traced the edge of it with her fingertips, testing it, trying to understand what she was feeling. It didn't move. That was new. Her brow tightened just slightly. "All right," she murmured to herself, as if saying it out loud might make it easier to explain. She tried again, pressing from a different angle. Still nothing. The same firmness. The same quiet resistance. Savannah leaned closer to the mirror, narrowing her eyes as if that would reveal something she had missed. The surface of the skin looked calm. No redness, no irritation, no sign that anything underneath it should be there at all. That didn't match. Normally, when something was wrong, the body made it obvious. Heat, swelling, pain, something that told you where the problem was and how serious it might be. But this wasn't giving her anything. And somehow, that made it harder to take seriously. She straightened up, letting her hand fall away. "Just a swollen gland," she said quietly. The explanation came quickly. Too quickly. But it fit just well enough to settle her thoughts. People got those all the time. From stress, from minor infections, from things that passed on their own without needing attention. She had heard that before. Maybe not from a doctor, but from enough people that it felt true. And it still didn't hurt. That mattered. If it had hurt, she would have done something. If it had burned, or itched, or spread across her skin in some obvious way, she would have taken it seriously. But it didn't. It just stayed. Savannah turned off the faucet and reached for a towel, drying her hands slowly. Her eyes flicked back to the mirror one more time. The shape was still there. Still small. Still quiet. Still easy to ignore. She let out a breath and shook her head slightly, as if dismissing the thought before it had a chance to grow into something bigger. "Tomorrow," she said under her breath. "If it's still there tomorrow." It was a promise she didn't intend to break. But it was also a promise she didn't feel the need to keep immediately. That was how things slipped. Not through recklessness. Not through carelessness. But through small decisions that made sense in the moment. Savannah walked out of the bathroom, turning off the light behind her. The house settled into its usual nighttime silence, the kind that wrapped around everything and made it easier not to think too much. Out in the distance, the wind moved faintly across the land, brushing against the side of the house with a soft, steady rhythm. Inside, everything was still. And for the rest of the night, Savannah didn't touch her neck again. But the feeling stayed with her. Not pain. Not even discomfort. Just the quiet awareness that something about it didn't behave the way it should. And that, more than anything, was what she chose to ignore. By the next morning, Savannah didn't think about it right away. That was the strange thing about habits. They took over before thought had a chance to catch up. She woke up the same way she always did, before the sun had fully risen, her body already moving through the motions of another day before her mind had fully settled into it. Boots on. Hat. Door open. The air outside was cooler than usual, carrying a faint trace of moisture that hadn't been there the day before. Somewhere in the distance, a low rumble suggested weather might be shifting, but not enough to change her plans. She stepped out, closing the door behind her, and got to work. For a while, everything felt normal, or at least, normal enough. It wasn't until she reached up to adjust the collar of her shirt that she noticed it again. Her fingers brushed the side of her neck, and stopped. Not because of pain, but because of how it felt. Savannah pressed lightly, then paused, her hand lingering in place. There was a difference. Subtle, but undeniable. The firmness she had noticed the night before was still there, but now it felt more defined, more contained, as if whatever sat beneath her skin had settled into its own shape. She pressed again, this time slower. It didn't shift, didn't flatten, didn't respond. A small crease formed between her brows. "That's new," she muttered. But even as she said it, she didn't stop what she was doing. Her other hand reached for the latch on the gate in front of her, pulling it open with a familiar motion. The work continued. Because that was what you did. You noticed something, you filed it away, and you kept moving, unless it demanded more. This still didn't. Not in a way she recognized. By mid-morning, The sun had climbed higher, and the temperature followed. Savannah moved along the fence line, checking for weak spots, tightening wire where it had loosened. The rhythm of the work helped. It always did. It gave her something to focus on, something concrete. But every so often, without meaning to, her hand drifted back to her neck. Each time, the same result. Firm. Still. Wrong. By the third or fourth time, she stopped pretending she hadn't noticed. Instead of brushing past it, she pressed a little more deliberately, tracing the edges again the way she had in the mirror. That's when she felt it. Not pain. Something else. A slight dullness. As if the skin around the area didn't fully belong to her anymore. Savannah froze for a second, her fingers still resting there. She pressed again, a little harder this time. The sensation was there but muted. Less sharp than it should have been. Less present. She pulled her hand away slowly, staring out across the land without really seeing it. That's not, she started, then stopped. There wasn't a word for it that fit cleanly. It wasn't numb. Not completely. But it wasn't normal either. And for the first time, a thought crossed her mind that didn't settle as easily as the others had. This wasn't acting like a bite. She stood there longer than she needed to, the open field stretching out in front of her, the wind moving through the grass in steady waves. Then she shook it off. Probably just pressure, she said under her breath. Another explanation. Another way to make it smaller. Because if it was small, it didn't require action. And if it didn't require action, she could keep doing what she was doing. That logic had always worked before. Around midday, Ethan showed up again. Savannah didn't hear his truck this time. She saw him first, walking along the edge of the fence, one hand resting casually on the top rail as he approached. "You're out here early," he said. "Same as always," she replied, not looking up right away. He studied her for a moment before speaking again. "You didn't answer your phone." Savannah shrugged. "Didn't hear it." That wasn't entirely true, but it was close enough. Ethan stepped closer, his gaze shifting briefly to her neck without trying to hide it this time. "That thing's still there?" he asked. Savannah hesitated, just for a fraction of a second. Then she nodded. "Yeah. Let me see." It wasn't a request so much as a quiet insistence. She turned slightly, brushing her hair aside. Ethan leaned in, closer than before, his expression tightening just a little as he looked at it. "It's different," he said. Savannah exhaled softly. "You said that yesterday." "I know," he replied. "It's more different now." She didn't answer. Ethan lifted his hand, hesitating briefly before placing his fingers lightly against the side of her neck, mirroring what she had been doing herself. He pressed gently, then frowned. "That doesn't feel right," he said. Savannah gave a small, almost dismissive shake of her head. "It's probably just a swollen gland." Ethan didn't move his hand right away. He pressed slightly again, testing it the way she had. "It's hard," he said. "Yeah. It doesn't move." "I know." That was new. Not the facts themselves, but the way she said them, like she had already noticed. Like she had already decided they weren't enough to change anything. Ethan pulled his hand back, his jaw tightening slightly. "Savannah, I'm fine," she cut in. Too quickly. Too firmly. The words landed between them, heavier than she intended. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The wind picked up again, carrying dust across the ground in low, drifting patterns. Ethan looked at her, really looked this time. "You don't look fine," he said. Savannah met his gaze, holding it steady. "I feel fine." It wasn't a lie. Not exactly, because what she felt wasn't pain. It wasn't sharp or urgent or overwhelming. It was just off. And off wasn't something you stopped your life for. Ethan let out a slow breath, running a hand over the back of his neck. "You should get it checked." There it was. The line she had been avoiding. Savannah looked away, out toward the horizon. "If it gets worse, I will." Ethan didn't respond right away, because they both knew what that meant. It meant waiting. Again. Finally, he nodded once. "All right." But there was no agreement in it. Just acceptance. Savannah turned back to her work, picking up where she had left off as if the conversation had settled something. But it hadn't. Not really. Because as the day went on, the feeling in her neck didn't fade. It stayed. Quiet. Heavy. And just unfamiliar enough that no matter how many times she told herself it was nothing, it refused to feel like nothing. The first time it felt heavier. Savannah didn't stop working. That was what made it easy to ignore. It happened sometime in the late afternoon, when the heat had started to settle into everything and even the wind felt slower, thicker, like it had weight to it. Savannah was near the back of the property, adjusting a section of fencing that had come loose again, her hands moving automatically through the task. She leaned forward slightly and paused. Not because something hurt, because something shifted. Not outside. Inside. Her hand moved instinctively to her neck. The spot was still there. But now, it didn't just feel firm. It felt present, as if it occupied space in a way it hadn't before. Savannah pressed gently, her fingers tracing the edges again, slower this time. There was a shape now, not just something under the skin. Something defined. Something that had settled into place. She swallowed. And this time, she noticed it. Not pain. Resistance. Small, but unmistakable. Her throat didn't move the same way. Savannah stilled. Just for a second. Then she straightened, exhaling slowly, her hand dropping back to her side. "It's nothing," she said under her breath. The words came out automatically, not because she believed them, because she needed them to be true. The sun was already lowering when Ethan arrived. Savannah didn't hear the truck this time either. She saw the shadow first, long, stretched across the ground before him. "You're still at it," he said as he approached. She didn't turn right away, just finishing up. Ethan stopped a few feet behind her, watching her work longer than usual. Something about the way she was moving had changed. Not enough for anyone else to notice, but enough for him. "You all right?" he asked. Savannah nodded, still facing away. "Yeah." Too fast. Ethan stepped closer. "Savannah." That made her turn. And for a moment, neither of them spoke. Because something in her face didn't match the words she had just said. It wasn't pain. It was effort. Like she was holding something steady that didn't want to stay that way. "What is it?" he asked. Savannah hesitated. That was new. Usually she didn't. "It just feels different," she admitted. Ethan's eyes shifted immediately to her neck. "Let me see." She didn't argue this time. She lifted her hair slowly, exposing the side of her neck without looking at him. Ethan stepped in closer. Closer than before. Close enough that he could see the subtle rise more clearly now. It wasn't dramatic, but it wasn't subtle anymore either. He reached out. His fingers hovered for just a second, then touched her skin. Savannah inhaled slightly. Not from pain, from awareness. Ethan pressed gently, then stopped. His expression changed. Not fear. Not yet. But something sharper than before. "That's bigger," he said. Savannah didn't answer. Because she knew. He pressed again, slightly firmer. "It's not just under the skin," he added quietly. That sentence hung in the air longer than it should have. Savannah turned her head slightly, pulling away from his touch. "It's just swelling," she said. But her voice didn't carry the same certainty as before. Ethan didn't argue. That was what made it worse. Instead, he stepped back half a step, studying her. "You said it didn't hurt," he said. "It doesn't. You said it didn't change." Savannah hesitated. "It hasn't changed that much." Ethan let out a slow breath. That was the moment things shifted between them. Not dramatically, not loudly, but enough. Because now, they were no longer talking about the same thing. They ended up sitting by the barn again. Same place, same light, but it didn't feel the same. The air had cooled slightly, the heat of the day finally loosening its grip. The sky stretched wide above them, streaked with fading color as the sun dipped lower. Savannah sat on the edge of the wooden beam, elbows resting on her knees. Ethan stood nearby at first. Then, after a moment, sat beside her. Neither of them spoke. For a while, it felt like every other evening they had spent there. Quiet, steady, familiar. But the silence was different. Heavier. Savannah reached up again, almost without thinking. Her fingers found the spot. Pressed. Paused. Ethan watched her this time. "You keep checking it," he said. She let her hand drop. "I don't even realize I'm doing it. That's usually when something's wrong." Savannah glanced at him. "Or when you think something's wrong." Ethan didn't respond right away. Instead, he leaned forward slightly, resting his forearms on his knees. "Does it feel the same?" he asked. Savannah hesitated. That question lingered longer than the others. "No," she said finally. Ethan nodded once. That was enough. Another silence followed. Longer this time. The kind that made everything else feel louder. The wind, the creak of wood, the distant hum of something far off. Savannah swallowed again. And this time, she felt it more clearly. That resistance. Still not pain, but stronger now, like something was pressing back. She shifted slightly, adjusting her posture, trying to make it go away. It didn't. Ethan noticed. "You felt that," he said. Savannah looked at him. Didn't answer. Didn't need to. Ethan leaned back, looking out toward the horizon. "You should get it checked," he said again. This time, softer. Not pushing. Just stating. Savannah stared straight ahead. "I said I would if it got worse." Ethan turned his head slightly. "It is worse." That landed. Harder than anything else he had said. Savannah's jaw tightened just slightly. "It's not that bad," she said. Ethan didn't argue. Again. Instead, he nodded slowly. "All right." But there was something in that "all right" that wasn't agreement. It was distance. The light faded. The sky darkened. And eventually, Ethan stood. "I'll come by tomorrow," he said. Savannah nodded. "Yeah." He hesitated for a second, like he wanted to say something else. Then, didn't. He walked back toward his truck, his figure slowly blending into the dimming light. Savannah stayed where she was. Alone now. The ranch stretching out around her. Familiar. Unchanged. And yet, something about it didn't feel as steady as it had before. She lifted her hand again, touched her neck, pressed, held it there longer this time. The shape was clearer now, the pressure deeper, and when she swallowed, she felt it again. That subtle resistance, that quiet push from underneath. Savannah closed her eyes for a brief moment, then opened them. "It's nothing," she said again. But this time, it didn't sound the same. The next morning, Savannah woke up later than usual. That alone was enough to feel wrong. Not dramatically, not in a way that set off alarms, but enough that when she opened her eyes and saw the light already pushing through the edges of the curtains, something in her paused. She lay there for a moment longer than she normally would, listening. To nothing in particular. Just checking. Her body didn't feel sick. It didn't ache. It didn't burn or pulse or demand attention. But it didn't feel right either. Savannah exhaled slowly and sat up, swinging her legs over the side of the bed. Her hand moved to her neck before she was fully awake. It stopped there. Pressed. Held. The shape was still there. Clearer now. More defined than it had been just a day ago. She swallowed. And felt it again. That resistance. Subtle. But no longer ignorable. Savannah closed her eyes briefly. Then opened them again. "All right," she said quietly. But there was no follow-up. No action attached to it. She stood, got dressed, and moved through her morning the same way she always did. Because that was easier. By mid-morning, the sun was already high. Savannah was outside again, working. Not because she felt great, but because stopping would mean thinking. And thinking would mean deciding. And deciding meant admitting something was wrong. Her movements were slightly slower today. Not enough for anyone else to notice, but enough that she noticed. Every now and then, she adjusted her posture without realizing why. Her neck felt heavier. Not painful. Just occupied. As if something was there that hadn't been there before. She ignored it. Like she had ignored everything else. Ethan showed up just before noon. This time, Savannah heard the truck. She didn't look up right away. Didn't stop what she was doing. But her shoulders tensed slightly. Ethan stepped out, closing the door harder than usual. That alone told her everything she needed to know. He had been thinking about it. All night. He walked toward her, not slowing down. "Savannah." She kept working. "Hey." That was her answer. Ethan stopped a few feet away. "That's it?" he asked. She finally looked up. "What?" "That thing on your neck." Savannah straightened slowly, wiping her hands on her jeans. "It's still there," she said. Ethan stared at her, waiting. Savannah didn't say anything else, because she knew what he was waiting for. "Did you get it checked?" he asked. There it was. Simple. Direct. No way around it. Savannah held his gaze for a moment, then shook her head. "No." The word landed flat. "Final." Ethan looked away briefly, exhaling through his nose. "Why not?" Savannah shrugged. "It's not that bad." Ethan let out a short, humorless breath. "That's not what I asked." She didn't answer right away. because there wasn't a clean answer. Not one that sounded good out loud. "I've got things to do," she said finally. It sounded weak, even to her. Ethan stepped closer. "Savannah." There was something in his voice now. Not anger. Something sharper. Frustration. Concern that had nowhere else to go. "That's not a reason." She looked at him, her expression tightening slightly. "It's not stopping me, is it?" That was the moment. The shift. Ethan's jaw set. "That's not how this works." "It is for me," she shot back. Too fast. Too defensive. The words hung between them. He studied her. Really studied her. Not just the surface. The way she was holding herself. The way her hand kept drifting toward her neck, even when she didn't realize it. The way her breathing had changed just slightly. "You don't look fine," he said. Savannah's eyes hardened just a little. "I said I am." Another silence. Heavier this time. Because now, they weren't just talking about the thing on her neck. They were talking about control. About who got to decide when something mattered. Ethan stepped back slightly, running a hand over his face. "You always do this," he said quietly. Savannah frowned. "Do what?" "Wait." That word landed. Hard. She didn't respond. Because she knew. He wasn't wrong. But that didn't mean she was ready to admit it. Ethan looked at her for another second, then nodded once. "All right," he said. Same word as before. Different meaning. He turned slightly, like he was about to walk away. Then stopped. "If it gets worse," he added, "don't wait." Savannah didn't answer. Because in her mind, it hadn't crossed that line yet. It wasn't worse enough. It wasn't clear enough. It wasn't painful enough. Ethan waited a second. Then another. Then he nodded again, more to himself than to her, and walked back to his truck. Savannah stood there, watching him go. The engine started. The truck pulled away. Dust rose behind it, drifting slowly across the ground. And then, it was quiet again. Savannah didn't move for a while. The ranch stretched out in front of her, unchanged. Same fences. Same land. Same sky. Nothing had shifted. Nothing had broken. Nothing had forced her to stop. She lifted her hand to her neck again. Pressed. Held it there. The shape was solid now. Undeniable. She swallowed. Felt it. That resistance. Stronger than yesterday. Still not pain. And that was enough. Enough for her to make the decision she didn't say out loud. She would wait. Just a little longer. Because if it was serious, it would hurt. That night, the feeling didn't wait for her to notice it. It was already there when she stepped inside, already sitting in her body like something that had settled in deeper than before, something that no longer stayed quiet just because she chose not to look at it. Savannah closed the door behind her, the familiar sound of the latch clicking into place, echoing a little louder than usual in the stillness of the house. The air inside felt heavier, or maybe it was just her. She set her keys down on the counter, her movements slower now, less automatic, like her body was beginning to move around something instead of through it. Her hand rose to her neck again, not out of habit this time, but because it needed to. Her fingers pressed against the side of her throat, and immediately she felt it firm, anchored, and larger than it had been that morning. Not dramatically larger, not something that would alarm anyone at a glance, but enough that her hand didn't have to search for it anymore. It was there, obvious, waiting. Savannah swallowed. The motion stopped halfway through before completing, like something inside had pushed back just enough to be noticed. She froze. That was new. She swallowed again, slower this time, focusing on the movement. It went through, but not smoothly, not clean. There was resistance now, not pain, just pressure. She lowered her hand slowly, staring straight ahead at nothing in particular. "It's just swelling," she said quietly, but the words felt thinner now, like they didn't hold the same weight they had before. She moved toward the sink, turning on the light, catching her reflection again. The shape was clearer tonight, not aggressive, not red, not inflamed, just present, like something that belonged beneath the surface more than it should. Savannah leaned closer, her fingers returning, pressing along the edge. The boundary was easier to trace now, defined, contained. That alone made something in her chest tighten slightly. She turned her head, testing the movement. There it was again, that subtle pull, not on the skin, but deeper, as if whatever sat there had begun to interact with things it hadn't before. She exhaled, longer this time. "You're fine," she said, but her voice didn't sound convinced. She stepped away from the sink, turning off the light, as if removing it from view might lessen it somehow. The house settled into quiet again, but it wasn't the same quiet. This one had weight. Savannah moved into the living room, lowering herself onto the edge of the couch, her posture more careful now without her realizing it. She leaned forward slightly, elbows resting on her knees, staring at the floor. Her breathing felt different, not labored, not fast, just shallower. Like her body was adjusting something on its own, she straightened slightly, taking a deeper breath. It worked, but not as easily as it should have. Her hand moved again, pressing her neck. The pressure pushed back, stronger now. She swallowed. There it was again, that same resistance, slightly more pronounced. Not enough to stop her, enough to remind her. Savannah stood abruptly, as if movement could break the sensation. She walked toward the kitchen, then stopped halfway, gripping the edge of the counter. A wave of dizziness passed through her, not spinning, not disorienting, just a brief shift, like the ground beneath her had tilted for a second, before settling again. She closed her eyes, waited. It passed. She opened them again. Everything looked the same walls, the same light, the same space she had walked through 1,000 times without thinking. But her body didn't feel the same inside it. "Okay," she said quietly, but this time there was no explanation attached. "No, it's nothing. No, it'll pass. Just the word." She tried to take another breath. Slower this time, deeper. It went in, but something about it felt restricted. Not blocked, just limited, like there was less room than there had been before. Her hand tightened slightly on the counter. She swallowed again. The pressure answered back. Stronger now. Two. Savannah pushed herself upright, stepping away from the counter, pacing once across the room, then back. Her movements were controlled, but there was an edge to them now. Awareness, calculation. She touched her neck again, pressing harder this time, as if force might change something. It didn't. It only confirmed it. The shape was larger, the pressure deeper, and for the first time there was no easy explanation that fit. She stood still in the middle of the room, her breathing shallow again, her eyes fixed on nothing. Then, slowly, she reached for her phone. Her thumb hovered over the screen. She knew who she would call. She didn't need to think about it, but she didn't press anything yet. Because that would mean something. That would mean she wasn't fine. Her hand lowered slightly. Then, another wave. This one stronger. Not enough to knock her down, but enough to make her step back quickly, catching herself against the wall. Her breath hitched slightly, not from fear, but from the sudden shift inside her body. She pressed her neck again, harder now. The pressure pushed back immediately, and this time she felt it move, not across the skin, not visibly, but deeper. A subtle shift inward, like something expanding into space that wasn't meant to hold it. Savannah's eyes widened just slightly. That was the moment. Not dramatic, not loud, but clear. This wasn't staying the same. This wasn't waiting for her to decide. This was moving on its own. Her hand trembled slightly as she lifted the phone again. This time, she didn't hesitate. She pressed the screen. It rang once, twice. Ethan picked up on the third. "Savannah?" His voice was already alert. She didn't realize how shallow her breathing had become until she tried to speak. "It's my neck," she said. A pause. Not long, but enough. "I'm coming," he said. The line clicked off. Savannah lowered the phone slowly, her hand still resting against her throat. The pressure was still there, the resistance, the tightness. Quote, her breathing stayed shallow, controlled, careful. She didn't sit down, didn't move much at all. Just stood there, waiting, her body adjusting in small ways she couldn't fully understand. Outside, in the distance, the sound of a truck engine cut through the quiet, growing louder as it approached. And for the first time since this had started, Savannah didn't try to explain it, didn't try to minimize it, didn't try to make it smaller than it was. She just stood there, one hand pressed to her neck, feeling the space inside her shift in a way it never had before, because whatever this was, it wasn't quiet anymore. By the time they reached the hospital, Savannah had stopped trying to measure what she was feeling, not because it had gone away, because it had settled into something constant. Ethan didn't say much on the drive. One hand stayed on the wheel, steady, controlled. The other reached across once or twice, not touching her neck, just her arm, like he was checking she was still there in a way that mattered. Savannah sat angled slightly toward the window, her hand resting against her throat, her breathing shallow but even. She wasn't panicking. That part never came. It was something else. A quiet awareness that things had moved beyond her control. The hospital lights came into view faster than she expected. Too fast. Ethan pulled up hard but not reckless, already moving before the engine fully cut. The door opened, cool air hitting her face as he came around to her side. "I've got you," he said. She nodded once. That was enough. Inside, everything changed. Not louder. Not chaotic. Just faster. The woman at the front desk looked up, ready to go through the usual questions, until she saw Savannah's hand at her neck. That was all it took. Her expression shifted, subtle but immediate. "What's going on?" she asked. "Neck," Ethan said. "Something's wrong." Savannah didn't add anything. She didn't need to. The nurse stood, already moving. "Come with me." No clipboard. No waiting. No routine. That alone said more than anything else. They moved through the hallway quickly, past rooms separated by thin curtains, past quiet conversations and low mechanical sounds. Savannah became aware of how different everything felt under this light. Cleaner. Sharper. Less forgiving. She was guided onto a bed, the paper beneath her crinkling as she sat. A cuff wrapped around her arm. A monitor clipped onto her finger. Someone asked her name, date of birth, simple things. But not the questions she expected. No one asked if it itched. No one asked what bit her. Instead, "When did you first notice it?" Savannah blinked slightly, adjusting to the shift. "A few days ago." "Has it changed?" A pause. "Yes." "How?" "Bigger." The nurse nodded once, already writing. "Any pain?" "No." Another pause. "Not concern." "Something else." "Understanding." "Trouble swallowing?" "Yes." "Breathing?" "A little." That was enough. The nurse stepped back slightly, speaking toward the doorway. "Can we get a doctor in here?" No urgency in her voice. But no delay either. Ethan stood against the wall, arms crossed now, watching everything with a focus that hadn't left him since they arrived. He wasn't interrupting. He wasn't asking questions. He was reading the room, and the room was telling him something. The doctor entered a moment later. Older, calm, observant. He didn't introduce himself right away. He looked first at Savannah, at her posture, at the way her hand hovered near her neck, then at the swelling itself. He stepped closer, stopping just short of touching it. "How long has it been there?" he asked. Same question. Different weight. "About 4 days, Savannah said. "Has it been getting bigger each day?" "Yes." The doctor nodded slightly. He still hadn't touched it. That detail didn't go unnoticed. Savannah felt it. Ethan saw it. "Any fever?" the doctor asked. "No." "Pain?" "No." The doctor glanced briefly at the nurse, then back at Savannah. "Difficulty swallowing is new?" "Tonight." "And the breathing?" Savannah hesitated. "Tonight." Another nod. The doctor finally put on gloves. Slowly. Deliberately. He reached out, placing 2 fingers lightly against the side of her neck, not pressing directly into the center, but along the edge, testing the boundary. Savannah watched his face. That was where the answer was. Not in what he said, in what he didn't. He pressed slightly, then stopped, moved his fingers a fraction lower, pressed again, then pulled his hand away. "How long since it started feeling like this?" he asked. Savannah swallowed carefully. "Tonight." The doctor nodded again, stepping back slightly. "All right," he said. That word again. But this time, it didn't feel like reassurance. He turned slightly toward the nurse. "Let's get imaging. Neck. Priority." Priority. Not urgent. Not emergency. But not routine either. Ethan shifted his weight against the wall. "What are we dealing with?" he asked. The doctor looked at him briefly, then back at Savannah. "We need to see what's underneath," he said. "Not what it is. What's underneath." Savannah felt her hand tighten slightly against her neck. Because for the first time, someone had said it out loud without saying it directly. This wasn't on the surface. It hadn't been for a while. And whatever was happening, it was happening deeper than she had allowed herself to believe. The waiting didn't feel long, but it didn't feel short either. It existed in that strange space where time stopped moving normally, where minutes stretched just enough for thoughts to catch up with reality. Savannah sat still on the bed, her hand no longer pressing her neck constantly, but never far from it either. The pressure hadn't gone away. It had settled into something steady now, something her body was trying to work around instead of resist. Ethan remained by the wall, arms still crossed, but his posture had shifted. He wasn't just observing anymore. He was listening to the pauses, to the words that weren't being said, to the way the room itself seemed to move differently around her. The doctor returned, not rushed, but more focused than before. He didn't sit down. He didn't soften his tone. He spoke the way people do when they don't have the full answer yet, but already understand the direction things are going. The neck is a tight space, he said, not looking at either of them at first, his attention still partly on the notes in his hand. There's not much room for anything extra. Savannah felt her fingers curl slightly against her palm. The sentence didn't sound alarming on its own, but something about the way he said it made it feel like a warning that had arrived late. He stepped closer, this time meeting her eyes briefly. "You have major vessels running through here," he continued, gesturing lightly near her collarbone and up toward her jaw. "Your airway, nerves, everything sits very close together." He wasn't rushing the explanation, but he wasn't easing it either. Each word felt placed, measured. So when something develops in that space, it doesn't have to be large to start causing problems. Savannah swallowed instinctively. She felt it, more clearly now. That same resistance, that same quiet push. The doctor noticed the movement. "That feeling you're having," he said, "when you swallow, that's not on the surface." He paused just long enough for that to settle. "That's pressure." Ethan shifted slightly. "Pressure from what?" he asked. The doctor didn't answer immediately. Not because he didn't want to, but because he wasn't going to guess out loud. "That's what we need imaging for," he said instead. Then, after a beat, he added, "But what concerns us isn't what you can see." His eyes moved briefly to Savannah's neck. "It's what's happening underneath." That sentence changed something. Savannah felt it. Not physically, mentally, because until that moment, part of her had still been holding on to the idea that this was something external, something that started outside and hadn't quite gone away, something temporary. But now, that idea didn't fit anymore. The doctor continued, his tone still even. "When something in the neck begins to grow or expand, it doesn't have space to spread outward easily." He gestured again, this time more subtly. "So it presses inward, against structures that are not meant to be displaced." Savannah's breathing shifted slightly, still controlled, but shallower again. Not because she couldn't breathe, because now she understood why it felt different. Ethan leaned forward slightly. "Is that why she's having trouble swallowing?" he asked. "Yes," the doctor said. "That's one of the reasons we take this seriously." He didn't over-explain. He didn't dramatize it. That made it worse. And breathing changes, even mild ones, matter in this area. Savannah stared ahead, her mind catching up piece by piece. Every small thing she had ignored now had somewhere to go. Every sensation she had dismissed now had context. Not pain. Not irritation. Pressure. Space. Something taking up room where there wasn't room to give. She lifted her hand again, pressing lightly against her neck, but this time she wasn't testing it. She was confirming it. The doctor watched her briefly, then spoke again. "You did the right thing coming in," he said. The words were meant to reassure. But they landed differently. Because of when, they were said. Not early. Not at the beginning. Now. Ethan heard it too. "You mean now," he said quietly. The doctor met his eyes for a second, and didn't correct him. That was enough. Savannah's hand slowly lowered. Because for the first time, she understood something she hadn't allowed herself to before. This wasn't something that had just appeared tonight. This had been building. Quietly. Underneath. And everything she had trusted. Pain, irritation, obvious signs, had never shown up. The room felt smaller after that. Not physically, but in the way information changes space. Savannah sat still, her posture more upright now, not because she was more comfortable, but because she was aware of her breathing, of her throat, of the way every small movement now had a meaning she hadn't assigned to it before. Ethan remained close, but not touching her. There was a line between them now, not distance, but caution. Like both of them understood that whatever this was, it had moved beyond something either of them could handle on their own. The doctor glanced once more at the notes, then at the nurse, then back at Savannah. "We're going to get imaging to confirm," he said. "Confirm. Not check. Not look. Confirm." Savannah caught that. "So you already know what it is?" she asked. It wasn't fear in her voice. It was something quieter, a need for clarity. The doctor didn't rush to answer. He took a breath, not to stall, but to choose his words carefully. "We know what it isn't," he said. That landed first. Ethan shifted slightly. "And that is?" The doctor looked directly at Savannah now. This isn't a typical bite reaction. There it was. Simple, clear, gone. Whatever explanation she had been holding on to since the beginning was no longer part of the conversation. Savannah felt something in her chest tighten slightly, not from the pressure in her neck, but from the way that one possibility had just disappeared completely. She didn't speak, didn't need to, because her mind had already moved ahead. "If it's not that," Ethan said, his voice lower now, more controlled, "then what are we looking at?" The doctor held his gaze for a moment, then answered, "It's behaving like a mass." The word sat there, heavy, not loud, but absolute. Savannah blinked once, just once, as if her body needed a second to catch up to what she had just heard. A mass. Not irritation, not swelling, not something passing through. Something forming, something occupying, something staying. The doctor continued, his tone unchanged, still steady, still measured. "We see this pattern when something develops beneath the surface rather than on it. It doesn't present with the usual signs people expect: pain, redness, inflammation. It stays quiet early on." Savannah's fingers curled slightly against the edge of the bed. Quiet. That word again. Now it had a different meaning. "It grows without drawing attention," he added. Ethan exhaled slowly, his hand moving to rest briefly against his hip before dropping again. "And now?" he asked. The doctor didn't soften the answer. "Now it's large enough to affect surrounding structures." Savannah swallowed. Felt it. That resistance again. Stronger, clearer, as if her body was confirming what had just been said. "And that's why you're feeling pressure," the doctor continued. "That's why swallowing feels different, why your breathing has changed." He didn't say danger. He didn't say serious. He didn't need to. Savannah stared straight ahead, her mind replaying the past few days in fragments. The mirror, the touch. The moment Ethan had said it didn't feel right. The way she had explained it away. The way she had waited. Every decision had felt reasonable. Every explanation had made sense at the time. That was the problem. She looked down at her hands. "They don't hurt," she said quietly. The doctor nodded. "That's not uncommon," he replied. And that was the part that settled deepest. Not uncommon. Meaning this wasn't unusual. Meaning this had happened before. Meaning people had missed it before. Just like she had. The room fell quiet again. But not the same quiet as before. This one had weight. Understanding. Finality. The doctor stepped back slightly. "We'll move quickly from here," he said. Savannah nodded faintly. But she wasn't listening to that part anymore. Because one sentence had already taken hold. Not loud. Not dramatic. Just clear. This wasn't something that had come and gone. It was something that had been there. Growing. While she waited. They moved quickly after that. Not rushed. Not chaotic. But with a kind of quiet efficiency that made it clear time mattered now in a way it hadn't before. Savannah was guided through another hallway, this one brighter, colder, more clinical. The air felt different here, cleaner, sharper, less forgiving. A technician spoke to her in a calm, practiced tone, explaining what would happen next, where to lie down, how long it would take. The words were clear, but Savannah didn't hold on to most of them. Her focus stayed somewhere else. On the pressure. On the space inside her neck that no longer felt like hers. Ethan stayed close, walking just half a step behind her, not crowding, not interfering, but never out of reach. When she lay back for imaging, he stood near the doorway, arms at his sides now, no longer crossed, watching, waiting. It didn't take long. Or maybe it did. Time had started behaving differently. When it was over, she was led back to the same room, the same bed, the same paper that crinkled beneath her weight as she sat again. But something had shifted not just in the room, but in the way everyone moved inside it. There was direction now. A plan. The doctor returned with that same measured calm, but this time there was something else in it. Momentum. "We're going to start treatment right away," he said. Savannah looked up. That word treatment landed differently. Not observation. Not waiting. Action. Ethan leaned slightly forward. So you can treat it? The doctor nodded once. We can manage what's happening right now. Reduce the pressure. Stabilize things. Not cure. Not remove. Savannah caught that. But she didn't hold on to it. Because the rest of it was enough. For now. A nurse stepped in, preparing equipment, explaining briefly what they were doing. Medication, monitoring, steps to control the situation. The movements were smooth, practiced. Nothing felt improvised. That helped. Savannah felt something in her chest loosen slightly. Not the pressure. Not physically. But mentally. For the first time since this had escalated, she wasn't standing alone in it anymore. Someone else saw it. Understood it. Was doing something about it. She exhaled slowly, her shoulders lowering just a fraction. Ethan moved closer now, stepping beside the bed. You're all right, he said quietly. It wasn't a question. It wasn't reassurance. It was something in between. Savannah looked at him. Really looked this time. The tension in his jaw hadn't left. But there was something steadier underneath it. Something that hadn't changed. I should have listened, she said. The words came out softer than she expected. Ethan shook his head slightly. You're here now. That was his way. No blame. No pushing backward. Just forward. Savannah nodded faintly. Her hand lifted again, resting lightly against her neck, not pressing this time, just feeling. The pressure was still there. But now, it felt contained. Watched. Like something had finally been noticed. The nurse adjusted something beside her, checking the monitor, speaking in a low voice that blended into the background. You might feel some changes as this starts working, she said. Just let us know if anything shifts. Savannah nodded again. Everything was moving. Everything was being handled. And for a moment, that was enough to believe in. Ethan pulled a chair closer and sat down beside her, not saying anything more. He didn't need to. His presence filled the space in a way words wouldn't have. Savannah leaned back slightly, her body finally allowing a small amount of tension to release. Not completely, but enough. She closed her eyes for a brief second. Just one, letting the sounds of the room settle around her. The quiet voices, the steady rhythm of machines, the movement of people who knew what they were doing. For the first time since it had started, it didn't feel like something she had to manage alone. And that created something she hadn't had before. Not certainty, not safety, but something close enough to it that her body recognized it as relief, even if only for a moment. The change didn't happen all at once. That was what made it harder to understand. At first, it felt like things were holding steady. The pressure in Savannah's neck didn't disappear, but it didn't worsen immediately either. The room stayed calm. The staff moved with the same controlled rhythm. The monitors continued their quiet, consistent signals, as if everything was under control. And for a while, it seemed like it might be. Savannah kept her eyes half open, watching the ceiling without really focusing on it. Her breathing was still shallow, but measured. The tightness in her throat hadn't gone away, but it no longer felt like it was increasing. It had settled into something her body was trying to adapt to. Ethan remained beside her, one arm resting on the edge of the bed now, closer than before. Neither of them spoke much. There wasn't much to say, because for the first time since this had started, they both believed they had caught it in time. That belief didn't come from words. It came from movement, from the way the doctors acted, from the fact that something was being done. And in situations like this, that was enough to create hope, even if it was fragile. Minutes passed, or maybe longer. Time didn't feel precise anymore. Savannah shifted slightly, adjusting her position. Her hand moved again to her neck, pressing lightly, then stopping. Something had changed. Not dramatically, but enough. The pressure felt deeper. Not veter. Deeper. As if whatever was there had moved further inward instead of outward. She swallowed. The resistance answered immediately. Stronger than before. Savannah's eyes opened a little wider. She didn't say anything right away. Instead, she tried again. Another swallow. This time, it didn't move as easily. Her hand pressed harder against her neck, instinctively, as if she could push it back. She couldn't. Ethan noticed. What is it? He asked quietly. Savannah didn't look at him. It's tighter, she said. That was enough. Ethan straightened slightly, his attention sharpening immediately. A nurse stepped closer, noticing the shift as well. What changed? She asked. Savannah tried to explain it, but the words didn't come as smoothly as before. It feels like it's pushing more. The nurse nodded once, already turning toward the door. I'll get the doctor. The room shifted again. Not louder, but faster. The doctor returned quickly this time. That was new. He didn't pause at the doorway. Didn't observe from a distance. He moved straight to her. What are you feeling? He asked. Savannah swallowed again. That hesitation, that delay, said more than her words. It's harder, she said. The doctor nodded, his expression tightening just slightly. He checked her neck again, more directly this time, pressing with more intention, mapping something only he could see. Ethan watched his face. That was where the truth was. Not in the words. In the change. Let's increase support, the doctor said, stepping back slightly. Still controlled. Still measured. But different. Ethan stepped closer. What's happening? The doctor looked at him. And this time, he didn't delay the answer. It's progressing faster than we expected. That was the first crack. Small, but enough. Savannah felt it. Not just in her body. In the room. Everything that had felt stable just minutes ago had shifted slightly off balance. Can you stop it? Ethan asked. The doctor held his gaze for a second, then answered. We're trying. Trying. Not can. Not will. Trying. Savannah closed her eyes briefly. Just for a second. Because she understood. Even if no one said it directly. Her breathing changed again. Shallower. More careful. Not because she was panicking. Because her body was adjusting to less space. She tried to take a deeper breath. It went in. But not fully. Her chest rose. Then stopped. Ethan reached for her hand without thinking. She let him. Her grip was weaker than before. Not dramatically, but enough that he noticed. The doctor spoke again, quieter now, but more direct. We need to prepare for the possibility that this has already advanced beyond early intervention. The words were careful, but the meaning wasn't. Savannah's eyes opened again. Slowly. What does that mean? She asked. The doctor didn't look away. It means we may have passed the window where this is easily controlled. Easily. That word mattered. Because it meant something else was still possible. Just not simple. Just not early. Savannah stared at him. Then nodded faintly, as if accepting something she hadn't fully processed yet. Ethan didn't nod. He didn't move at all, because he understood exactly what that meant. And he knew when that window had been. Days ago. When it didn't hurt. When it didn't feel urgent. When it was still small enough to ignore. Savannah's hand tightened slightly around his. I thought, she started. Her voice caught. Not from emotion. From the pressure. I thought it was nothing. The room stayed quiet. No one corrected her. Because that was the truth. Not medically. But personally. The doctor stepped back slightly, giving space that didn't feel like comfort. We'll continue, he said. And they did. But something had already changed. Not in the equipment. Not in the procedure. In the outcome. Because from that point on, they weren't trying to stop something early. They were trying to manage something that had already gone too far. Savannah leaned back slightly, her body no longer trying to fight the sensation the same way. Her breathing stayed shallow. Controlled. Limited. Ethan didn't let go of her hand. Not once. And in the quiet space between the sounds of machines and measured voices, one thing settled in fully. Not loudly. Not suddenly. But completely. By the time she understood what it was already too late. The ranch didn't change. That was the first thing Ethan noticed. The fence line still stretched the same way across the land, worn but standing. The barn still cast its long shadow in the late afternoon, just as it always had. The wind still moved through the grass in slow, steady waves, carrying dust across the open space without asking anything in return. Everything was still there, exactly where it had been. And that was what made it feel different. Ethan stood near the fence, one hand resting on the top rail. His weight shifted slightly to one side the way it always was when he stopped to look out across the land. His hat sat low, shadowing his eyes, but it didn't hide the stillness in him. He had been back for a few days. Long enough for things to settle. Long enough for the quiet to feel permanent. The house behind him was the same too. The door, the windows, the worn steps leading up to the porch. Nothing had been moved. Nothing had been changed. Because there was nothing to fix. That was the problem. Ethan exhaled slowly, his gaze fixed somewhere far beyond the fence, not really seeing anything specific. The place didn't feel empty. Not exactly. It felt paused, like something had stepped out of it for a moment and hadn't come back. He pushed himself off the fence and walked toward the barn, his boots pressing into the dry ground with a familiar weight. Every step felt known, measured, the same path he had taken more times than he could count. But now, there was no one walking beside him, no voice cutting through the quiet, no small movement at the edge of his vision, just the sound of his own steps. He reached the side of the barn and stopped. The wooden beam was still there, the same one they used to sit on, the same place where the light hit just right in the evening, softening everything around it. Ethan looked at it for a long moment, then sat down. Slowly, the wood creaked under his weight. That hadn't changed either. He rested his forearms on his knees, his hands hanging loosely, his gaze fixed ahead. For a second, it almost felt the same. Like if he waited long enough, she would walk up beside him, brushing dust off her hands, saying something simple, something ordinary, something that didn't try to mean more than it did. Something like, "You're early." Ethan let out a quiet breath. The memory didn't hurt the way he expected it to. It settled. Stayed. He glanced to the side. The space next to him was empty. Not dramatically, not loudly, just empty. And that was enough. The wind shifted slightly, moving through the open structure of the barn, brushing against the wood, carrying that same dry scent that had always been there. Ethan reached down, picking up a small piece of gravel, rolling it once between his fingers before letting it drop. There was no reason for it. Just movement. Something to do with his hands. His eyes lifted again, scanning the horizon out of habit more than intention. Everything was still. Everything was working the way it always had. The land didn't stop. The world didn't pause. It just continued. And for a moment, that felt harder to accept than anything else. Ethan leaned back slightly, resting against the rough wood behind him. His gaze drifted again, slower this time. Then, something caught his attention. Not far, just near the edge of the barn door. A small movement. Subtle. He stood, stepping toward it without thinking. It was nothing unusual. Just a small patch of disturbed dirt near the threshold. Something had shifted there. Maybe an animal. Maybe the wind. But as he looked closer, he noticed something else. A faint mark. Barely visible. He crouched slightly, brushing his fingers over it. Then paused. It was small. Almost nothing. The kind of thing no one would notice unless they were already looking. Ethan stared at it for a second longer. Then slowly, he stood. His hand lifted, instinctively moving toward his own neck. He stopped halfway, then let it drop. His gaze returned to the ground, then shifted outward again, across the ranch, across the land that hadn't changed. But he had. And now, he noticed things differently. The quiet ones. The small ones. The ones that didn't hurt. Ethan turned slightly, looking back toward the house. The door remained closed. The windows still. Everything exactly as it had been. And yet, not the same. He stood there for a long moment, then finally stepped away, walking back toward the fence, his pace steady, his posture unchanged. But something in him was paying attention now, because some things don't ask for attention. They don't demand it. They don't hurt. They don't warn. They just stay quiet, until they've taken up more space than they should. And by then, it's already too late. If you listen closely, stories like Savannah's don't begin where we think they do. They don't begin in the hospital. They don't begin when something becomes dangerous. They begin much earlier, usually with something small, something easy to explain, something most people would ignore. As a physician, I've seen this pattern more times than I can count. A patient comes in with something that doesn't look serious at first glance. No pain, no dramatic symptoms, no clear signal that anything is wrong. And because of that, it's often dismissed by the patient, sometimes even by people around them. That's where the problem starts. Because the body doesn't always follow the rules we expect. We're taught, in a very informal way, to trust pain, to believe that if something is serious, it will hurt, that it will demand attention, that it will make itself known in a way we can't ignore. But that isn't always true. In fact, some of the most concerning conditions we see begin in silence. They grow slowly. They adapt. They don't interrupt your day. They don't stop you from working, from moving, from living. And because of that, they're easy to overlook. A mass in the neck is one of those things we take seriously for a reason, not just because of what it is, but because of where it is. The neck is not a place with extra space. Everything that keeps you functioning, your airway, your blood flow, your nerves, runs through a very confined area. There's no room for something extra to develop without affecting something else. And when something begins to grow there, it doesn't always show itself on the surface. It doesn't always cause redness or inflammation. It doesn't always hurt. Instead, it does something quieter. It takes up space. At first, that space is small. You might feel something unusual if you press on it. You might notice a firmness that wasn't there before. Maybe a slight difference when you swallow. Nothing alarming. Nothing urgent. But over time, that space increases. And as it does, the body begins to adjust. Breathing may feel slightly different. Swallowing may feel tighter. You might feel pressure, not pain. And because it's not painful, it's often ignored. That's the critical mistake. Not because people are careless, but because the signals are subtle, and subtle things don't feel dangerous. There are a few signs we always tell people not to ignore. If something in your neck feels firm, especially if it doesn't move when you touch it, that matters. If it stays for more than a couple of weeks, that matters. If it slowly grows, even without pain, that matters. And if you begin to notice changes in swallowing, breathing, or even just a sense of pressure, that matters even more. You don't need all of these signs for something to be serious. Sometimes, just one is enough. The earlier something like this is evaluated, the more options we have. That's what we refer to as a window, a period of time where intervention is simpler, more effective, less invasive. And sometimes, that window is quiet. It doesn't announce itself. It doesn't tell you when it's closing. You only realize it was there after it's gone. That's what makes stories like Savannah's difficult, because nothing she did was unreasonable. She didn't ignore severe pain. She didn't overlook something dramatic. She responded the way most people would. She waited. She observed. She told herself it would pass. And for a while, that made sense. Until it didn't. If there is one thing to take from this, it's not fear. It's awareness. Pay attention to what your body does, but also what it doesn't do. Don't wait for pain to tell you something is wrong, because sometimes pain never comes. And by the time something finally demands your attention, it may already be asking too much.
Thank you for staying until the end with Return to Life. If you found a sense of connection or a small spark of hope, carry it with you as you return to everyday life. We look forward to seeing you in the stories ahead.